told why.
On the nights the trials took place, a convoy of vehicles would leave RAF Swanton Morley. An operative from the chemical defence establishment would head the team on their top secret mission. They drove to various locations on the outskirts of Norwich to install sampling devices set up to detect clouds of zinc-cadmium particles which would imminently be released from a military aircraft and carried on the wind.
An aircraft would take off. It would fly 25 miles away from the centre of Norwich. At night, it would be spraying out zinc-cadmium sulfide all the time. As the cloud approached Norwich at night, there was Porton had a mobile dark room that would be at the leading edge of the cloud. It would take air samples every few minutes, quickly shine a UV light onto the samples just to see if anything fluoresced. The minute anything fluoresced in great numbers, they knew that they had this zinc-cadmium sulfide cloud coming through.
Arrival is 25 and counting.
The official Porton history of the zinc-cadmium sulfide programme says a very strange thing about Norwich. It says that the exposure was, however, considerable. This is a very strange statement. They do not make this statement for the rest of the trials that were carried out, and there's over 100 of them in the UK. But in Norwich, they specifically mentioned that it was a considerable exposure.
The Ministry of Defence declined to be interviewed for this programme, but they did issue this statement.
Zinc-cadmium sulfide was widely used at the time of the trials by a number of different countries as an air movement tracer in meteorology and was regarded as safe.
Cadmium naturally resides in the soil, but any increase in the levels present as a result of these trials and any potential health risks are causing concern. Jean Cordy grew up next to an allotment where one of these sampling machines was placed.
I believe that there could be a link between my mother's cancer and the tests that were carried out of Norwich from the fact that we ate our own vegetables that my father grew. I'm also concerned that my brother and I, as we ate the same produce, might actually end up with the same disease as my parents did. My mother was a brilliant grandmother, absolutely adored her grandchildren, and she always looked on them as her boys, always used to ask how her boys were, and I know of anything that they'd miss her, and you know, she missed seeing them growing up, which is unfair.
We do indeed see more patients, newly diagnosed patients with esophageal cancer than we might expect to see for the population, and certainly compared to some other parts of the country. Many of them will have worked on or lived off the land. It's quite striking, but I think that probably reflects the part of the country that we're in. We're in a part of the country that's, of course, intensely agricultural, and I think that to some extent reflects that. But it is something that would, I think, make one look for a possible link.
Last winter, Wyn Parry and Norwich North MP Dr Ian Gibson, amid a flurry of newspaper coverage, forced a health inquiry. It reported that there were indeed significantly high numbers of throat cancer in Norfolk.
There's some kind of evidence there might be clusters and so on, but you see, you would never know, because a lot of these agents wouldn't just go into people's bodies, but they would go into the crops that they ate as well. And this being a crop growing area at that time, who knows? Who knows what people recorded on death certificates or records on what's wrong with people and so on.
A second study, this time by Imperial College, confirmed the higher trend of cancer in Norfolk. However, once the figures were adjusted to reflect age and gender, they said it's unlikely that exposure to the toxic spraying is to blame. Now the Chief Medical Officer, Sir Liam Donaldson, has concluded that there is no excess risk to throat cancer across Norfolk compared to the rest of the country.
Somebody should be running around Norfolk now to see how much esophageal cancer there really is, what's been missed, and what the true figure might be. Maybe Wyn Parry is the man to do it.
It's a case unproven, and we have two facts. We have the fact that we have many more patients with cancer of the esophagus in Norfolk than we might expect to see for our population. And we also have the fact that in the 1960s, a chemical was dropped over part of Norfolk and a sizable part of Norwich that we know can cause health risks. They are two separate facts, and it would be speculation to link them, but as a scientist I think it would be sensible to look at that, which is something that we would hope to be able to do in the fullness of time.
But what about Cardington and Bedfordshire? The local MP, Alistair Burt, knew nothing of the trials which affected so much of his constituency. Inside Out showed him the details of what we discovered. So Alistair, you've had a chance to look at this report now. Just how shocked are you that zinc cadmium sulphide was sprayed out of the back of a lorry?
It does seem quite extraordinary that it was done in that way, because when you think of the height of the particles when they came out, that have been incredibly close to land, to people, they wouldn't have been as easily dispersed in the air as they would have been if they'd been dropped from an aeroplane, and it does seem an extraordinary story.
So what are you going to do now? I mean, you know, are you going to take this to somebody and say, hey, you know, what was going on all those years ago?
I think there's an issue about the times that this was done in, and I think people were more unquestioning about what happened then, and I think there's a certain amount of that it's not possible to reopen. But plainly, whether or not there was any impact from what happened then as to what's happening today in terms of health, it is terribly important to discover.
What answers will you be looking for about the way things were carried out here?
I think my constituents are entitled to the same answers as MPs have sought in different parts of the country in terms of what these trials were about, what precisely happened here, any possible consequences. But in particular, because of the way in which these trials were carried out, the fact that they were done so differently here, the lorry travelling around, the numbers of times per day they were done, the way in which the stuff was produced and introduced into the atmosphere here, that's palpably different, as far as we're aware, from what may have happened somewhere else. Now, accordingly, I think it's up to me to talk to the health authorities here in Bedfordshire to ask them whether there's any possibility of there being any incidences of cancer, any clusters of cancer that might possibly have been related to this. And I think that work has to start now, because with this being so long covered over, having brought it to mind now, we've got to find out in order to reassure people to make sure they know that they're safe.
From what we understand of cadmium, it can remain in the environment for some time afterwards. I think if they were aware of the full spectrum of risks, then it was probably questionable at the very best.
The question whether this was a correct thing to do is, as I say, not a question that we were asked to approach. That's a question for government. I mean, one can see that in the 21st century that would probably be considered very improper. At the height of the Cold War, people's views on this may have been slightly different. And although one is always terribly sympathetic to people who are sick, it's terribly dangerous to, for this reason, impose causality on things that happen to be in your mind, but there is really no reason to believe that anybody came to any health harm from it.
Well, I've read Professor Langman's report. I think he's an excellent scientist, good at analysing data, but he's only as good at analysing as the data he actually gets. I think there are lots of gaps that need to be covered and looked into.
Now they have to admit that actually since the tests, doubts about the safety of that compound have arisen, and that, I think that's very politically damaging for them. And the problem that they've got is that they're left with not very reliable data, but also the other problem that they have is that they've released a whole load of material out into the countryside, and they're not absolutely sure how much they have actually released, which causes them a problem when they're asserting that it's completely safe. I mean, it's a bit of a cock-up, really.
I'm not particularly looking forward to what the times ahead, because it's certainly not a very pleasant death, and I think this is an absolute dreadful thing. I think they're just sweeping everything under the carpet, and just how they always do with everything.
Quite often it's just getting that public apology that's important. Some minister, some Prime Minister has to stand up and say sorry about what happened years ago.
The population of Norfolk, the population around Bedford, in fact the whole east of England, could still be at risk from future experiments, which the Ministry of Defence refused to rule out.
There's more background to this story on